My family treated me like an investment. My husband treated me like a prop. I made sure I was the one who won in the end. I was never meant to have a choice. At least, that's what my parents made me believe. Growing up, I was always the afterthought. My younger brother, Eric, was the golden child, the one who got all the attention, the best education, the endless chances. Me, I was just the daughter. A burden, an investment my parents hoped would pay off one day. And that day came when I turned 24. My mother sat me down one evening, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "We found you a match," she said, like she was arranging a business deal instead of discussing my life. My father, ever the pragmatic one, folded his hands and added, "Daniel Carter. He comes from a very good family. Marrying him would be the best decision for all of us." For all of us, never for me. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. But then I saw the way they were looking at me, expectant, firm, like this had already been decided. "I don't even know him," I said. "And I don't want to marry someone just because." My mother cut me off, sighing dramatically. "Don't be selfish. Do you think people like the Carters just marry anyone? You should be grateful they even considered you." Grateful, as if being sold off was an honor. I fought, I begged, I tried to argue that this was my life, that I had a future of my own, but my father's patience wore thin, and the threats came quickly. "Do you want to see us homeless? Your brother still needs a future. Don't you care about your own family?" And then, the guilt. "We raised you, gave you everything. You owe us this much." That was the moment I realized I wasn't their daughter. I was their bargaining chip. And this was the price they had decided I would pay. The first time I met Daniel Carter was at a private dinner in a restaurant my family could never afford on their own. He was handsome in a detached way. Perfect suit, perfect smile, but cold eyes. He barely acknowledged me as his mother, Eleanor Carter, examined me like a piece of artwork. "She's presentable," she murmured, sipping her wine. "With the right guidance, she could be a suitable wife." Daniel nodded once. "This works for me." Like I was nothing more than a business transaction. My parents, of course, were thrilled. My mother beamed. My father shook Daniel's hand firmly. It was a done deal. Just like that, I was no longer a person. I was property. The wedding was extravagant, luxurious, soulless. Every detail was crafted for appearances. Not for me, not for us, but for the people watching. I stood at the altar, Daniel's hand resting lightly over mine, cameras flashing in the background. Strangers whispered about how lucky I was. Lucky to have landed someone like him. Lucky to be part of that family. No one saw the truth. No one cared. After the ceremony, we barely spoke. The car ride to his family's estate was silent, and when we arrived, I felt like I had stepped into a museum. Grand, cold, untouchable. That night, in our suite, Daniel finally addressed me. He poured himself a drink, leaned against the fireplace, and regarded me with quiet detachment. "You don't have to pretend," he said. "I know you didn't want this any more than I did." I swallowed hard. "Then why did you agree?" His lips quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because it's expected of me." I should have felt relieved. At least he wasn't going to play the devoted husband while keeping a mistress on the side. But instead, I just felt empty. "You can do whatever you want," he continued. "Buy whatever you want, travel, keep yourself entertained, just don't embarrass the family." There it was, my role in this marriage. I was an accessory. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my wedding dress, feeling the weight of the diamond ring on my finger like a shackle. I had known this wouldn't be love, but I hadn't realized just how alone I would feel. Then, as I processed his words, something clicked in my mind. If I was just an accessory, that meant they weren't really watching me. They weren't expecting me to matter. Which meant I had one thing they hadn't considered: the element of surprise. The days after the wedding felt surreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life. I had a husband, but no real marriage. A luxurious home, but no warmth. A family, but not my own. Daniel and I barely spoke. In public, we played our roles. He held my hand at events, posed for pictures, and made just enough small talk to keep up appearances. But the moment we were alone, it was like we ceased to exist for each other. At first, I told myself it could be worse. He wasn't cruel. He didn't berate me or demand things I wasn't willing to give. In a twisted way, he was almost considerate. He gave me space, left me to my own devices, and never acted like he expected anything from me. but the silence was unbearable. I spent my days wandering the mansion, getting lost in rooms I had no business being in. I memorized the schedules of the housekeepers and staff just to have some form of human interaction. My phone buzzed constantly, but it wasn't Daniel. It was my family. The first call came just 2 weeks into the marriage. "Sweetheart, how's married life?" my mother cooed, but I could already hear the expectation in her voice. I gave her the answer she wanted to hear. "It's fine, Mom." "That's wonderful. Listen, your father and I were thinking, now that you're settled, maybe you could help out a little. Ease the pressure on the family." There it was, the real reason she called. "How much?" I asked, my voice flat. She hesitated for exactly 1 second before saying, "Just a small loan, darling. Your brother is struggling right now. You know how hard it is for young men to find good jobs these days." My grip tightened on the phone. "A small loan? 50,000. I almost laughed. "Almost. I don't have access to that kind of money," I said truthfully. "Daniel handles everything." She clicked her tongue in disapproval. "Well, that's something you need to fix. A wife should have control over household finances. How else will you take care of your future children?" The implication wasn't lost on me. If I couldn't give them money now, I was expected to produce an heir. A child who would be their golden ticket into the Carter wealth. I hung up before she could say anything else. But it wasn't the last call. It never was. If I thought my parents were bad, the Carters weren't any better. Eleanor Carter, my mother-in-law, had a way of making me feel like I was constantly being evaluated. She never outright insulted me, but her comments were laced with condescension. "You'll need to be more mindful of your appearance, dear. A Carter wife is always presentable. Your posture at the gala last night was a little stiff. You should practice walking in heels more often. It's been 3 weeks. When do you plan on giving us a grandchild?" That last one nearly made me choke on my tea. I forced a polite smile. "I don't think Daniel and I are in any rush." Eleanor's lips thinned. "Men like my son need stability, dear. A family, a reason to stay committed." I understood exactly what she was saying. Daniel might not care about this marriage, but his family expected me to keep him tied down. If I didn't, I was expendable. And then there was Daniel's sister, Victoria. She had been polite at first, cool but civil. But the moment she realized I wasn't just a quiet little puppet, the claws came out. One evening, at a family dinner, she smiled sweetly at me and asked, "So, what exactly do you bring to this family?" The table went silent. Even Daniel looked up from his drink. I swallowed down my irritation. "I wasn't aware I needed to bring anything other than myself," Victoria smirked. "Oh, come on. You don't think you're actually one of us, do you?" Eleanor didn't say anything, but she didn't defend me either. Daniel? He just kept drinking. And that was the moment I knew. If I wanted to survive here, I needed to stop playing the helpless victim. I had accepted that my marriage was nothing more than a formality. But that didn't mean I was prepared for what I found next. Daniel didn't love me. That much was clear. But I hadn't realized just how absent he truly was. I barely saw him. He came home late, left early, and spent most of his time at business meetings that conveniently lasted overnight. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow him. I expected a club, a poker table, maybe even a secret apartment. But what I found was worse. Daniel was at a private lounge, sitting across from a woman, a very familiar woman. Her name was Emily Sinclair. She was a model, beautiful in the effortless way that made people stop and stare. She was also his ex-girlfriend. And judging by the way he leaned in close, the way his hand rested casually on her thigh, she wasn't just his ex. She was still in his life. My stomach twisted, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't heartbreak. It was rage. Not because he had a mistress. I never expected loyalty from him, but because of the absolute audacity of it. Because of how he had humiliated me in front of his family, how he let them tear me down while he snuck off to be with someone he actually cared about. Because of how everyone treated me like I was disposable. And that's when I decided I wasn't going to be disposable anymore. I was going to play the game, and I was going to win. For the first few months of my marriage, I let things happen to me. That was my biggest mistake. I thought that if I stayed quiet, if I played along, things would eventually settle. That Daniel would keep ignoring me. that his family would tolerate me as long as I didn't make trouble, that my own parents would be satisfied with what they had taken from me. I was wrong. When you're weak, people don't just leave you alone, they take more. So I had two choices: stay silent, stay controlled, let them shape me into whatever they wanted. Push back. But what I didn't realize was that pushing back meant inviting war. I had been watching, listening, learning. I had noticed the cracks in Daniel's business. I knew that his company was struggling, that his father's old-fashioned management style was costing them. But what I didn't realize was that just because I saw the problem didn't mean I had the power to fix it. At a high-profile charity gala, I made my first real move. It was a casual conversation, Daniel's colleagues discussing investment strategies. Normally, I would have stayed quiet, but this time, I spoke. I think Carter Industries needs to diversify, I said. Real estate isn't as stable as it used to be. Expanding into tech would be a smarter long-term strategy. Silence. I felt Daniel stiffen beside me. One of the investors, an older man who had known the Carter family for years, chuckled. That's an interesting thought, Mrs. Carter. And what exactly makes you qualified to give business advice? My face burned. I had prepared for resistance, but I hadn't prepared for humiliation. Before I could say anything, Daniel placed his glass down with a sharp clink and smiled coldly. My wife has been very interested in business lately, he said smoothly, but perhaps she should leave it to the professionals. Laughter. Dismissive nods. I had miscalculated. I thought I could just step in and be taken seriously, but these men weren't interested in hearing from me. And Daniel? He had just reminded them where I belonged. That night, in the car ride home, I stared out the window, seething. Daniel didn't say anything until we pulled into the driveway. Then, with a casual shrug, he said, "Next time, don't embarrass yourself." That was the moment I knew. If I wanted power, I couldn't just take it. I had to earn it. After that night, something shifted between me and Daniel. I wasn't the quiet, obedient wife anymore, and he noticed. At first, he was amused. "Studying business now, are we?" he teased one morning at breakfast. "Planning to take over my company?" But when he realized I wasn't just playing around, the amusement faded. I started asking questions. About our finances, about investments, about the prenup I had never read properly before. Daniel didn't like that. "Why do you suddenly care about this?" he asked one evening. "Because it affects me." He leaned back, studying me like I was a puzzle he hadn't solved yet. "You're changing. Maybe I was never what you thought I was." For the first time, I saw real tension in his eyes. Daniel was used to controlling things. His business, his relationships, his image. He thought he had married a silent, compliant woman. Now, he didn't know what to do with me, and that meant I was finally becoming a problem. If Daniel was beginning to notice my defiance, his mother saw it before he did. Eleanor Carter didn't believe in outbursts. She didn't yell, didn't threaten. Instead, she invited me to lunch. I should have known what was coming. We sat in a pristine, high-end restaurant, the kind of place where you spoke in soft, calculated tones. "I see you've been quite active lately," she said, stirring her tea. I played dumb. "I don't know what you mean." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "My son has enough to worry about. His wife should be a source of support, not distraction." Distraction. Not a person, not a partner, just something meant to keep Daniel stable. "I just want to understand the business," I said carefully. "Wouldn't that make me a better wife?" Eleanor's expression didn't change, but her next words were a warning. "A Carter wife knows her place. Don't forget yours." Cutting off my parents was supposed to be final, but they weren't done with me yet. A month after I stopped sending them money, my brother showed up at my house. Eric, the golden child. The one who had never once cared about me until he needed something. "Mom and Dad are struggling," he said. "You have everything now. You can't even help your own family?" I stared at him, something sharp curling in my chest. "I helped," I said, "for years, and it was never enough." He scoffed. "God, you've really changed, haven't you? You think you're better than us now?" "No," I said, stepping closer. "I just finally see things clearly. I had spent my entire life being told that I owed them, that my worth was tied to what I could give. But standing there, looking at my brother, the person they had always chosen over me, I realized something. They had never expected me to leave. And now that I was strong enough to stand on my own, They hated it. Tell Mom and Dad this, I said quietly. I was never their daughter. I was just their investment. And now, the deal is off. I shut the door in his face, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something. I had been humiliated, underestimated, controlled, but now, I wasn't just surviving, I was fighting back, and soon, they would all regret underestimating me. Power wasn't something you could just take. It had to be earned, stolen, or won, and I was finally ready to claim it. For months, I had been playing the game, watching, learning, making my moves carefully. But now, it was time to end it. The cracks in Daniel's business were no longer hidden. Investors were pulling out, rumors of mismanagement were spreading, and for the first time since I married him, Daniel looked vulnerable. He wasn't the untouchable man I had met at the altar. He was distracted, stressed, slipping, and I was about to make it worse. Through quiet research and strategic connections, I had started moving my own money. It wasn't much, just enough to position myself in the right places. I invested in companies that were quietly rising as Daniel's business sank. And then I made my final, ruthless move. I reached out to one of Daniel's biggest investors, the one who was on the fence about pulling out. Over coffee, I smiled and said, "Wouldn't you rather place your money somewhere more stable?" He raised an eyebrow. "And where would that be?" I leaned in. "With me." By the time I walked away, Daniel had lost one of his key backers, and when he found out, he finally saw me as a real threat. That night, Daniel didn't ignore me. He stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him. "That was you, wasn't it?" he hissed. I looked at him calmly. "You're going to have to be more specific." "Don't play dumb," he snapped. "You spoke to Harrison. You convinced him to walk away from my company." I tilted my head. "I didn't convince him. He just made a smart business decision." Daniel let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "I underestimated you." "Yes," I said. "You did." He stepped closer, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "What do you want?" It was the first time he had ever asked me that. "To be free," I said simply. Silence. Then, his jaw tightened. "You want a divorce?" I nodded. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. But you know what that means, right? If you leave first, you walk away with nothing." I smiled. "That's where you're wrong." Daniel thought he had all the power. That if I filed for divorce first, I would leave with nothing. But what he didn't know was that I had finally read the fine print. The prenup had a clause, one Daniel had likely forgotten about. If I filed for divorce under the grounds of infidelity, I was entitled to a financial settlement. And Daniel? He had been cheating on me since day one. I had the proof, photos, witnesses, even his own credit card statements detailing the expensive dinners, hotel stays, and gifts he had bought for his mistress. So the next morning, I filed for divorce first, and this time, Daniel couldn't stop me. When the divorce went public, Daniel's family went into full damage control. Eleanor Carter tried to spin the narrative, painting me as the ungrateful wife who had failed to support her husband. Victoria? She was delighted. I had been a threat to her from the start, and now she was finally rid of me. But Daniel? He wasn't done fighting. 1 week after I filed, I got an unexpected call from my parents. My mother's voice was dripping with fake concern. "Sweetheart, we heard the news. This is such a difficult time for you. Why don't you come home?" I almost laughed. "Come home? To what?" She sighed, her tone turning sharp. "We're just saying, now that you're leaving that family, you should remember who your real family is. We supported you for years and—" "No," I cut her off. "You sold me. And now, you want me back because you think I'm walking away with money." Silence. Then the truth slipped out. "You wouldn't even have this life if it weren't for us." There it was. They never cared about me, only what I could give them. "You're right," I said quietly. "I wouldn't have this life if not for you, and that's exactly why I'm never coming back." And with that, I cut them off for good. The last time I saw Daniel was at the final divorce settlement. He looked different, colder. "So this is it," he said. "This is it." He studied me for a moment, then chuckled bitterly. "You really played the game better than I did, didn't you?" I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. "I just finally learned the rules," I said simply. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Relief. I wasn't a pawn anymore. I wasn't someone's investment, someone's trophy, someone's afterthought. I was finally free. and I would never let anyone take that from me again. Final line, they thought they owned me, but in the end, I was never theirs to begin with.